Hello and welcome back to Cutting Edge Faith. I'm Ryan Howard, and I've got a special guest with me today, Pieter Friedrich, and he is a freelance journalist, and he specializes in analysis of current and historical affairs in South Asia with a particular focus on the issue of Hindu nationalism and Christian persecution that is happening in India, and some of those ties to groups in the United States. So I'm excited to talk with him today. Pieter, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ron. It's a pleasure to be here, and urgent and grave issue to be discussing. So I'm so happy to be covering this topic with you today.
Yeah, and we've done a lot of coverage of Christian persecution around the world. Sometimes I think it's the best kept secret in the church here in the U.S. that people just really don't know what's going on. And I shared our listeners, if they heard back in December of 2022, I played a clip of you talking in Frisco, Texas, about some of this fundraising that was happening from Hindu groups in the United States to fund destruction and persecution of churches in India. And so that link will be in the show notes for people who want to listen to that. And we also had an episode number 126 just about the truth of Christian persecution in India. But, we've got a lot to get into here with what you're up to. So maybe just give us a little bit of background of sort of just quickly how you got into this, and then we'll get into what's really happening here.
Sure, yeah. And as you mentioned, best kept secret about Christian persecution around the world. And I would, of course, so glad that we're highlighting India today, because I would argue that India is probably the best kept of the best kept secrets about persecution ongoing against Christians in the world today. Well, as we get into this and try and peel back the onion a little bit, yes, I'll touch a little bit about my own background and what got me into this. Long story short, I was 20 years old when I encountered members here in California, where I grew up, members of the Indian immigrant community or the Indian diaspora. And since I was 20, I'm 37 now, I've been doing this for almost 17 years this year. What happened was I encountered in particular Sikh Americans who are from northern India primarily. And I started learning about issues related to the country that were brand new and fresh to me, as far as persecution, actually in this case, in India, of Sikhs, of a genocide that their community suffered at the hands of the government then, which was, going to be a little bit different then from what we're talking about now, because back then it was the opposition party. It was a Hindu nationalist government, or it was not a Hindu nationalist government like India has today. And I, as a kid that grew up, don't appreciate everything about my upbringing, with all due respect to my parents, and that's another story. We're on good terms on that now, and basically on the same page on that now. But as a kid growing up, one of the things that I think I really value was I managed to, thanks to my parents, consume a real steady diet of literature, both nonfiction and fiction, novels, documentaries, and feature films about the Second World War, about the Holocaust, about resistance fighters, about a lot of the Christians that suffered and survived through that period, or some of them that were martyred, but also those that survived. In particular, one that's near and dear to my heart is Corrie ten Boom from the Netherlands, who wrote that famous book, The Hiding Place. And I think that left a real deep impact on me that sunk into my heart, into my psyche, my soul, as far as influencing me to have this intrinsic disdain for, if you would, although I don't know if that's the correct word, but this intrinsic deep-seated gut opposition to authoritarianism, totalitarianism, fascism. Mm-hmm. And so when I encountered these members of the Indian immigrant community, Indian Americans, who'd gone through some, more modern day experiences within the past, at the time, 20, 30 years, I got a chance initially, as I just got into this, to meet people who were family members of people who were minorities, who were murdered for their faith, murdered for their politics. I got a chance to meet people who'd been tortured in custody by the government. That really hooked me. And I started digging deeper. And from there, India is such a diverse and complex place. So that's just one place to start, meeting, for instance, Sikh Americans who survived a lot of these atrocities, particularly back in the 80s and the 90s. I got a chance from there to meet people who are from quote unquote lower caste or outcast communities, and begin to learn about the caste system in India, which is still actually in practice in a large way today, even in 2023.
Yeah.
And then from there, just progressively, I got a chance to meet Indian Muslims, who are one of the biggest persecuted communities in India today under this Hindu nationalist movement, and Indian Christians, who are swiftly becoming, alongside, interestingly enough, Indian Muslims, Indian Christians are swiftly becoming one of the most persecuted communities, minority communities in the country of India. And over that time period, as I was learning about these issues and then invited by the community to begin researching them, writing about them, and speaking about them, and welcomed with open arms by these minority communities to do so as an American growing up here in California, there was a change of government, of administration or regime in India. In 2014, there was a regime elected, headed by Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who is from the political party, the BJP, which, I apologize, wrapping your mind around these issues, sometimes a lot of acronyms to throw out. And so I'll try and limit that, but a few of them are important, especially the ruling party or the governing party, the BJP. This Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, elected in 2014 from the BJP, happens to belong to this political party, to helm this, as the PM, the Prime Minister, to helm this political party as head of state. But this political party is a very different type of political party from a lot of the ones that we're familiar with around the world. The BJP is the political wing of another organization, a paramilitary organization called the RSS. So the ruling party with the Prime Minister Modi at the head is the BJP, but the BJP is the political wing of this paramilitary organization called the RSS, which is a Hindu nationalist organization, which is deeply devoted to this ideology of turning the country into a nation, into an officially Hindu nation, where non-Hindus are treated as foreigners, where it's propagated that the only true patriot in the country is somebody who must belong to the Hindu religion. And from that point, when he was elected in 2014, that's the point at which I began shifting the bulk of my attention initially, and now almost exclusively my entire attention, to covering issues of Hindu nationalism in India, as well as covering issues of how Hindu nationalism is actually directly connected to us here in America.
Those are, so we're going to dive deep into some of this. And I mean, it's really incredible, some of the things that you have uncovered and shared with some of those connections. And I want to get into that, but before we do that, give us a picture of what life really looks like for Christians and people undergoing this persecution in India, whether it's violence, family life, private life, community life, church life. I mean, is it different in different regions of the country, or just give us a little bit of a lay of the land, what that looks like?
Yeah, it is different in different regions of the country. Now, this Hindu nationalist government holds national power, but roughly, to generalize, in the north, that's kind of the center of their power base, vote base. The south tends to be, and has historically been, quite a bit different. And while there's a huge Hindu population in the south, this idea of Hindu nationalism has not actually made so much headway, especially in particular states in the deep south of India. But that is beginning to change in certain segments of southern India, especially over the past couple of years, as this government has held power for almost 9 years now, going on a decade. And what does it look like? Well, this is primarily for Christians and Muslims. So here's the situation ideologically, is that this ruling party, the BJP, and its basically parent organization, this RSS paramilitary, so oftentimes it's talked about them being the BJP RSS in the same breath. So the BJP RSS, they hold this ideology of Hindu nationalism, that Hindus are the only sons of the soil, the only people native to the land, and that India always has been, is today, and always must be reserved as a land for and only for Hindu people. Now, within that paradigm, they are particularly concerned about targeting Christians and Muslims. They basically have a view of minorities, which is for Christians and Muslims, that they want to exterminate them from the land. Sikhs and Buddhists and some other minorities are also targeted, but they basically, the Hindu nationalist movement basically views them as people to be minorities to be assimilated rather than directly eliminated. In the case of Christians and Muslims, they're viewed ideologically as foreign elements that don't belong to India, as because they're foreign elements, they're an internal threat to the national security of the country. And because they're non-Hindus who follow what is viewed as a foreign religion, they are essentially, in so many words, traitors. Within that paradigm, they're targeted for, primarily Christians and Muslims are targeted for violence. And with the ruling party being this Hindu nationalist government, what we've seen today over the past 9 years since 2014 is year over year, there's a progressive increase in the level of violence that they're targeted with. Most of it in today's India, with the current administration being what it is not actually state sponsored directly, meaning the government itself is not actually perpetrating these acts of violence. It's more state sanctioned or state tolerated with silent implicit approval. Yeah. Where what happens is most of this violence is directed by mobs, which are fielded typically from specific Hindu nationalist organizations, which are directly linked to this RSS paramilitary, which is the parent organization of the ruling party. And this, I won't get into all the organizations, but basically this RSS organization, as kind of the fountainhead or the mothership of this whole movement, has an entire network of subsidiary or affiliated organizations which basically are linked to it and intersect with it and serve special interests purposes. You know, that they have organizations for students, they have organizations for religious purposes, for education, for charity, for lawyers, for farmers, and so on and so forth. And these are the subsidiary organizations, these affiliate organizations within this family of Hindu nationalist groups that are all linked back to this RSS paramilitary. They're the ones that are going out on the streets these days, increasingly, you know, more and more year over year, and targeting minority groups, in particular Christians and Muslims. Some of the ways that they've been doing that are through acts of lynching, for instance, in the case of Muslims. And it's important, it's difficult to talk about what's happening in India without talking about how Muslims are also being targeted by Christians. And just to preface that, I know that many Christians in America are not familiar with that idea of like a shared victimhood, if you will, of Christians and Muslims. But India is unusual in being perhaps the only country in the world, and certainly the only democracy in the world, where both Christians and Muslims are being targeted at the same time, for the same reasons, and by the same source. And so one of the ways, and this happens to Christians as well, but one of the ways in which Muslims, for instance, are targeted is they're accused of eating or possessing beef, which, for those unfamiliar, the cow is considered by many people within the Hindu religion as having some kind of a sacred nature. And so Muslims are oftentimes accused of possessing or eating beef, oftentimes with no evidence whatsoever. And a mob will gather, they'll go into somebody's house where they're suspected of doing that, or the person is accused of doing that.
Alleged, yeah.
And lynch them, drag them in the streets and murder them. They'll go after Muslim cattle traders, chase them down, surround and stop their trucks and drag the person out of the truck, beat them up and typically oftentimes murder them, so on and so forth. They'll also, in the case of Muslims, they'll go after a young Muslim man who is seen in the company of a Hindu girl. Maybe they're dating, he has a Hindu girlfriend. They'll go accuse him of hoodwinking her and trying to dishonor her just because he's going out on a date with a Hindu girlfriend, and again beat up or lynch. And they will do things like they'll see, as Muslims pray throughout the day 5 times a day, they'll see a Muslim man that's stopping to pray on the sidewalk, which is very common and has been historically in India, and they'll go up and beat him up and or kill him. They will do things like see a Muslim man who's walking down the street who's wearing identifiably Muslim clothing and surround him and demand that he chant slogans praising a particular Hindu god. And even if he does, because he's in fear for his life, they'll still typically beat him up or even kill him, typically while doing this and a lot of these other acts of violence on camera in film, which they themselves are filming and then putting out to boast about their act of violence. This has also translated over to similar treatment of Christians. Now, Christians are suffering in many ways similar atrocities, but more specifically to Christians, some things that they might be suffering today. One would be is if you have a Christian that's going door to door attempting to hand out pamphlets, or not even door to door, but just in a public place, in a plaza, handing out tracts. They might be surrounded, their tracts seized, their Bibles seized and burned, while the person may then potentially be beaten up. And other instances as well, but the main one as far as Christians and as far as how it affects the community life and the church life is that, and this is probably the most typical basically atrocity that we're seeing occur against Christians, especially over the past 2 to 3 years, is that they will be gathering for Sunday service. And as they're doing that, a mob might gather outside of the church. And when I say a mob, these mobs have been well documented as being anywhere from 50 to 100 to 250 to sometimes 500 people gathering outside of the church while the congregation is inside worshiping. Wow. And oftentimes the mob will be accompanied by the police, and the mob will oftentimes be armed. They will then burst into the sanctuary, they'll smash up the sanctuary, disrupt the whole service. They'll seize the priest or the pastor, the clergy member, they'll start beating them up. They'll start beating up the congregants. They'll drag everybody outside into the street. And then if the police aren't already there, what the mob will do is they'll take these victimized Christians who just had their church, their Sunday worship service busted up. They'll drag them down to the local police station and hand them over to the police, accusing the Christians of having been engaged in forced conversion or something like that. And 9 times out of 10, 99 times out of 100, in most of these cases, the police will end up filing charges against the Christians for doing something like forced conversion, instead of filing charges against the attackers, the perpetrators. And over the past couple of years, in 2021, for instance, approximately 80% of the violent attacks against Christians across the whole of India were of that style, of mob attack style. In 2021, I think the final numbers by Indian Christian organizations that came out, and these vary because it's a chaotic situation where it's hard to document exactly how many attacks occur. And many of them go unreported because people are scared to report them. But in 2021, I think the final numbers were along the lines of 700 to 750 attacks across the entirety of India. Wow. Which, when you contextualize that as perhaps 80% of them being mob attacks, is a much more significant number even than it already is, because it means it's not one person attacking one person. It means it's a mob of hundreds of people attacking, a congregation of dozens or scores or 100 or more. And so the number of people that are actually being victimized massively escalates when you have such a huge percentage of the attacks being these kinds of mob incidents. In 2022, the number of attacks, if I recall correctly, has come out recently, last month, I believe, as being reported as somewhere in the number of about 1,150 or 1,170 across the whole country. And breaking down how many of those were mob attacks, I don't believe that's occurred yet. That's research in progress. But what I have seen is that, and just, I mean, just those 2 years, 2022, 2021, would, offhand demonstrate. But what I have seen, what I've written about, is how we've seen every single year, I think except for one exception, every single year since 2014, in the documentation of the numbers of attacks on Christians, we've seen these numbers of attacks going up and going up and going up, 150 to 200 to 300, and on all the way to getting to 2022 last year being well over 1,000. So yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that, I mean, I think we kind of get a feel now for what you mean by maybe not the state's not maybe necessarily doing it, but they're sanctioning it and tolerating it. And I mean, that paints a pretty bad picture. And I know, could you talk about, you mentioned conversion, so forced conversion. I think there's an anti-conversion bill as well. Or perhaps there's, I think there's talk from Prime Minister Modi about religious tolerance and all that, but obviously the actions don't align with that. Okay, could you parse that out? What's going on?
Yeah, I often break down how like the persecution is occurring at both the street level and the state level. Mm-hmm. And as we just discussed, basically the street level. And no, that's not being directly perpetrated in most cases at the moment by people who are from the state. Mm-hmm. Although over the past 30 years of the Hindu nationalist movement, there are a number of notable incidents where members of the state governments have engaged directly in the persecution. But in this case right now, with the national power being held by this Hindu nationalist movement, it's more like silently sanctioned, that they're ideologically aligned with the mm-hmm. reasons behind the persecution, but they're happy to leave all the dirty work, all the wet work to these mobs in the street who belong to organizations that are actually linked with the ruling party. Now, at the state level, one of the major ways in which persecution is being perpetrated is, yes, through what are called anti-conversion laws. And there is currently no anti-conversion law at the national level. And passing one would be a massive deal, a massive victory, certainly for this Hindu nationalist movement, because the Indian constitution is really strongly protective of religious freedom in most ways. But what there are anti-conversion laws at the state level within approximately 35 or 40%, I would say, of the currently, I believe it is 29 states in India. So out of those 29 states, if I recall correctly, it's changed in the past couple of years. I think it's 29, it might be 28. But out of those, almost half of those states have on the books being enforced right now what are known as anti-conversion laws. And basically what these laws do, and they vary as far as the provisions from state to state. Most of them are pretty similar, but different states have different penalties. Different states have different requirements as far as what you have to do if you want to convert. But by and large, most of them say that if somebody wants to change their religion, and this is primarily targeted at Christians, so that it actually impacts everybody in the country of both Hindu and non-Hindu religion. Actually, it also impacts Hindus because it curbs their own access to religious freedom. Mm-hmm. What they basically say is that if you want to change your religion, you have to inform the local government, and basically you have to inform it's a little difficult to analogize directly to the U.S., but like the local mayor or something like that. You have to go down to the local bureaucracy and tell them that you plan to change your religion and get permission. And oftentimes, most of the time, these laws include waiting periods, where if you go to the local bureaucracy, you inform them you want to change your religion, you have to undergo like a 30 or 60 sometimes 60-day waiting period before you're allowed to. And in some cases, I believe you have to, I believe the burden of proof is actually on you, the person that wants to convert, to prove that you're converting, in converting, that you're not being coerced, that you're not being paid off, that you're not being, somehow, you're not doing it out of fear.
Right.
And which is the justification that these laws all have written into them, is that they're designed to prevent quote unquote forced conversions, coerced conversions, or coercion is, and sometimes explicitly detailed to mean, but typically just basically interpreted as meaning, even if it's not explicitly stated, meaning that if you're converting, for instance, to Christianity, because you have come to firmly and genuinely believe that God will send you to hell if you're not a Christian, because like you want to get to heaven, things like that, that qualifies as converting out of coercion.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
So, and then the penalties for these, and again, these laws vary. So I'm kind of generalizing because there's about 12, 13 of them on the books, and they all are pretty similar, but provisions vary. The penalties can range in the worst cases to being up to 10 years imprisonment if you do this, if you convert without following this law. The laws also vary, but most of them tends to target both the potential convert and the person who is quote unquote doing the conversion. Yeah, which is kind of a big aspect of how conversion is viewed within this paradigm. Is that it's not something where I've had a change of heart and I want to convert. It's something that's being done to me by a third party. That this person, this priest or this pastor, they're converting me instead of I'm choosing to adopt this religion. So both the person that's quote unquote doing the conversion and like the conversion ceremony, like a baptism, as well as the person that wants to convert, are generally impacted by these laws. And either one or both can be arrested for violating them. Now, the big concern is that going forward, the national government, headed by the BJP with this Hindu nationalist ideology, could potentially pass a national anti-conversion law to affect the whole country, which is something that members, significant leading members of the government, not Modi himself, but members of his cabinet, have actually specifically floated interest in the past 4 or 5 years or so. And especially, as I mentioned, if they did take that step, it would be a huge victory for them, but also a huge hurdle that they would have to jump to accomplish that. The real concern about the real possibility of that happening, however, is that the current government has first came into power in 2014. They were then re-elected with still Prime Minister Modi as head of state in 2019. They're heading again for national elections in 2024 in May of next year. And aside from some miracle occurring, it's an almost certain thing that they're going to come back into power next year, which would mean that they're in power for 3 administrations, going on, if Modi almost certainly would be coming back as their prime minister, which would put him in power in the country for going into, at the conclusion of this term, it'll be 10 years, re-elected to a second or third term, put him in power for up to 15 years. And we've seen, what I've seen is, since the administration was re-elected in 2019, after that point is when they really began to aggressively and with a great deal more speed, I oftentimes use the term with blitzkrieg speed, implement a lot of their much more overtly Hindu nationalist policies impacting minorities, as well as we began to see a rapid increase in the amount of the violence, both in degree and numbers, perpetrated by these mobs in the streets. And so if this government comes back into power next year, Then as far as at the state level, the persecution with the potential for national anti-conversion law and other types of laws that they're passing to target minorities, as well as the potential for an increase in street level violence is just massive.
Well, and that was answered my next question, which was about the future here. And so we see it's not going to be changing anytime soon without some radical change of pace or change of direction. But I think there's a lot more we can get into there as well. I know there's not softer, I don't like the word softer, but persecution that's maybe not necessarily violent, but maybe educational or business or, getting a job or that sort of thing too.
Massively, and I'll just touch on that briefly, but
yeah,
there's all kinds of that against Christians and Muslims in particular. There's job discrimination, housing discrimination, social boycotting. So that's become a huge thing, especially in the past year or so. And one of the things that we see, and it's so shocking to see it because these are calls for social boycotting, which are filmed by the people making the calls. And this is one of the primary reasons that we know they're happening, is because the people making the calls are filming them themselves and putting them out. And then we see them openly, unapologetically making such calls. Routinely for the past year or so, there have been massive conferences held throughout India on probably at least dozens of occasions, conferences of hundreds, even thousands of people in the audience, where there are prominent Hindu nationalist leaders, Hindu nationalist priests, demagogues, I call them, sometimes who are up there on the stage with members of the ruling party, the local ruling party, at least the local BJP, on stage with them while this calls are being made. And they're leading the audience in calls to refuse to buy from, sell to, rent to, et cetera, Muslims and Christians, and then sometimes even beyond that, calls to wipe out Christianity and Islam from the country.
Jeez.
and leading them not just in calls, but in oath-taking ceremonies, where in many of these cases, these oath-taking ceremonies that are being led to target minorities like this include on-screen distribution of weapons. Typically, in this case, in this situation, it's typically knives and swords.
Wow. So yeah, it's unending. And I know I've had this, there was a new Foreign Contributions Regulations Act that impacted even our ability to give support to ministries and people in India to help move those things forward. So obviously they're even coming with a technological approach to lessen the impact there as well. But I know a lot of what shifting gears here, focusing kind of in the US, give us a little bit of what's going on, what you've been finding and seeing in the US from that's sort of propping up or supporting there over in India. What are you seeing here in the US?
Sure. So, and that's a huge deal. That's actually one of my primary focuses for the past 3 or 4 years, is researching, documenting, and exposing the way in which American Hindu nationalist organizations and individuals are aiding and abetting what's occurring in India. And with this RSS in India, for instance, this paramilitary that's the parent organization of the ruling Hindu nationalist BJP party. The RSS has an international affiliate, which is called the HSS, which is basically RSS abroad. And we have that here in the US. We have that actually globally in dozens of countries around the world. But one of the big places that we have it, one of the most significant, is in the US. The HSS in America, according to their own statistics, has about 230 or so branches around the country, with, in some states, bigger hubs than others. The HSS is certainly the leading Hindu nationalist organization in America, but there are other Hindu nationalist organizations which are also affiliates of other Hindu nationalist organizations back in India. So there's this whole family of Hindu nationalist organizations in India, basically subsidiary to the RSS as the head. And many of those in India, they have corollaries abroad, including here in the US. In the US, most of the ones that we have tend to be basically, well, they're legal entities. They intersect both in activities and agenda as well as leadership with the HSS. One of the only other one that I would name at the moment, so as not to confuse people that are new to this, is called the Overseas Friends of the BJP. So the RSS is paramilitary parent organization of the BJP as the HSS in America as its international affiliate. The BJP in India has in America the Overseas Friends of the BJP, which is basically the American wing of the BJP. Which, a side note, was just a couple of years ago finally compelled to register as a foreign agent within America. Now, HSS and OFBJP, along with a number of these other Hindu nationalist organizations in the country, serve, I would say, a twofold purpose: to be a support base for the regime back in India. First is more directly related to their activities of what they're doing in America or from America back in India. And one of the primary things that they're doing, have been doing, is tracing back to 2014 when the Modi regime first came into power. The OFBJP, the Overseas Friends of the BJP, and the HSS, these American Hindu nationalist groups, began mobilizing in the States to work to support the election of Modi back in India. To do that in a couple of ways that I would name. First, these groups here in America began setting up phone banks around the US. Phone banks which, according to their own open admission or bragging about it, consisted of, in some cases, 500-700 people who, in their words, sat in America, 500-700 people at a phone bank, and in their words, were calling around the clock back to India to call Indian voters from America, keeping in mind, and this certainly proven, but I can say with full confidence, keeping in mind that vast majority of the people that are doing this in America, who are members of these American Hindu nationalist organizations, who belong, etc., they're American citizens who have they're either first generation who came to the US and had to give up their Indian citizenship to join this, to become citizens of the US, or even second generation or third generation, typically first and second. But they're sitting in these phone banks, they're calling back to India before the election to contact tens and tens and tens of thousands of Indian voters and tell them to vote for the BJP, which is a huge, impactful, influential tactic, because you have all of these people they've left India, come to America, found success. They're really people that tend to be looked up to by Indians as models. That's you've accomplished something. That's what we want to emulate. And so their opinions on this bear huge weight. That was one thing. The other thing was, from America, and then keeping in mind, saying with full confidence based on my research, vast number of the people doing this were American citizens, not Indian citizens. They organized at least maybe as many as 3,000 people to volunteer to literally travel from America back to India, to spend sometimes months at a time as basically campaign workers for the BJP. So you had thousands of Indian Americans, US citizens, from these Hindu nationalist organizations who mobilized to go back to India to go knock on doors, go participate in election campaign rallies, and in some cases, apparently even serve as poll workers, running polls in order to support the election of Modi. It played a huge role for his success in an election in 2014. A lot of things I could go back to about ways in which I've seen it demonstrated that the BJP and Modi back in India recognize the significance of that support in them achieving electoral success, and ways in which he's even coming here to the US to kind of pay them back the debt of gratitude that he owes. They again mobilized similarly in 2019 when the regime was already entrenched, and their mobilization efforts in that capacity probably were significant but of less immediate need. The other way that I'll say that the American internationalist movement and groups work to aid and abet what's happening in India is they hope to be basically a propaganda mouthpiece for the regime here on the ground in America.
Mhm.
They do this in a lot of ways. The HSS, for instance, does this by systematically working to get their foot in the halls of political power at a city, state, and federal level. They get photo ops with local politicians, especially at the city level and county level, get resolutions from local politicians who are not bothering to do their research and just they see this group and they think it's a benign religious organization and they just toss them a resolution, which after hundreds of these are stacked up, begins to give this group a huge veneer of credibility, as well as after they've already gotten these from the local cities, gives them that foothold in the local halls of power.
Mhm.
They also work not as an organization, but their leadership and their membership work. And this is one of the huge things that I've worked on in the US, work in what seems to be undeniably a systematic, organized fashion across the country to help elect particular politicians, especially to state legislature and especially to the US Congress.
Mhm.
And in the case of one of the more recent politicians to the lieutenant governorship of Maryland. And they do this by what appears to me to be very intentional, very systematic funneling, among other things, of financing to these politicians on an all fully legal level to really fill up their coffers to the extent that in some cases, one of the initial politicians that I've documented this about was now former Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard from Hawaii. In one case, in her first two elections, first two terms in Congress, I've documented over about 4-year period, ranging anywhere from these donations from these particular sources, highly documentable as being from them, ranged anywhere from 20 to 25% of her year-over-year campaign financing.
Wow.
Putting it to such a level that I would say that there's definitely strings being attached there. And so the concern is then, depending on what position this politician is elected to, and especially if they're in US Congress, what committees they're assigned to, and especially, say, for instance, in the case of Congresswoman, now former Tulsi Gabbard, with everything she had going for her as far as her image initially, and as far as really being viewed as a rising star within her particular political party, the concern is that once these people get in, that they gain a position of influence within our government, where they can really work to derail and sabotage any attempts within Congress to hold the internationalist movement regime accountable, to call out their human rights atrocities, and so on and so forth, and put forward policies in particular that would further entrench the US in the direction it's already going with full speed, but further entrench the US as an unconditional friend of India, which, to wrap up that thought, I would say is one of the main problems that we're seeing, especially with these people in politics in our government who are either sometimes maybe ideologically aligned personally, or simply so unprincipled as to be willing to go where the money wants them to go, as to look at what's happening in India and push for this, again, we're already full speed ahead on that as far as the direction of the US-India relationship, push for this relationship between our countries where we're deeply entangled militarily, on a trade level, as de facto allies, viewing India as what the US wants it to be, as hopefully a bulwark against the global influence of China and so on and so forth, as an unconditional friend. And as myself, a friend of India and Indians, somebody that's been working on these issues for 17 years, deeply entangled with, on a personal level, with people living in India presently, as well as with Indian Americans and members of Indian immigrant communities across Europe and North America more broadly. As somebody that's so close to these people, has so much love for them, gets so much love back for them, as an American, I want my country to be a friend of India, a strong friend of India. But I want my country to be a friend of India with the condition being that we should have friendship be premised on respect for human rights by both our countries, on respect for and upholding of religious freedom by both our countries, et cetera, and also with eyes wide open that with all of this goal that is within these geopolitical agendas of, for instance, using India as hopefully like a balance against the global influence of China, that we're realistic and that we understand, well, that might be a good potential idea. The direction India is going is a direction of fascism with murder of minorities, with stripping away of civil liberties, with flat out denial of civil rights, with potential for, which we've seen sporadically over the past 30, 40 years, with potential for even outbreaks of massacres in the streets, which are either tolerated, sanctioned, or perhaps maybe even someday, if it continues this direction, perpetrated by the state. And that as that happens, India is, as one would expect of any fascist, authoritarian, totalitarian government, India is going to be progressively a weaker and weaker partner for the US and an unreliable partner. And that's something that I think our US government really needs to take into account, which, as we have members of US Congress, for instance, being elected, or members of politicians within other forms of governments throughout our country who are either sympathetic to or financially accountable to donors who support what's happening back there in India, that especially with them being oftentimes being Indians and Hindus, and with their voices as such, oftentimes being given extra credibility as far as their perspective on what we should do vis-a-vis India. I don't see it going in a good situation as far as the US government doing what it needs to do on this issue.
Yeah, and I mean, I agree with sort of this coming together needs to have conditions. I mean, we saw with China, they were welcomed into the world trade and all this, and we think they're going to change their ways. And it's like, no, they're that government, oppressive government, sort of has filtrated into other countries, and so it's gotten worse. It's been backwards. And I mean, I've worked with India since 2004, so it's coming up on 20 years, and I've been to India a half dozen times, and I love the people of India. But you know, I've done global sourcing strategies for parts, things in India and outsourcing, coming out of India and into India and all that. And it's just so critical that our government leaders have their eyes wide open. But like you said, not only are they not wide open, or perhaps maybe they're intentionally closing them, but they're compromised. And
it's so important too that these figures in the US government, I'm just talking about your mainline ones, not talking about the ones that might be compromised as far as their donor base or that sort of thing, but the main decision and policymakers, that they are discreet and thoughtful about which Indian voices they choose to listen to, because the narrative that's propagated, and this is the main propaganda hook that's thrown out there by the Hindu nationalist organizations, both in India and in America, is that any criticism of what's happening in the country right now is anti-Indian. It's only being put forth by people that either hate, that hate the country and want to see the country fail, or don't like the success of the country, or have some kind of a bad faith interest in the country. And yet, when it comes to my work and my engagement with Indian immigrant communities, just Indian Americans in this country, and what I'm hearing not from Hindu nationalist organizations, which is a very specific small slice segment of the Indian American community, but from anti-Hindu nationalist Hindus in America, from Christians, Indian Christians, from Indian Muslims, from Indian Sikhs, from Dalits, those formerly known as outcasts or untouchables, from basically all of these widely diverse segments of the Indian American population. What I'm hearing is they want the US government to actively and vociferously speak up on these issues. These are Indian Americans saying, we want the US government to speak about India. Because then they're saying it, they're not saying it because they're anti-Indian. They're saying it because they have
Right.
deep love and affection for their country, and they're shedding tears about the direction their country's going.
Yeah. That's such a critical point, and I think it's just the reality. I mean, we and that's what we're doing with this podcast, is just shining light on this, exposing this so people can know. Maybe real quickly, there was one more example we were talking about before we hit record on a more local politician that you did some work with. You were invited. I mean, you're invited to go to these different areas. You said you travel for months throughout the year.
Last year, 2022, I spent about 3 months on the road. And I spent time in New Jersey, Illinois, Ohio, and Texas, as well as in other areas. I'm from Northern California. I spent time in Southern California.
So
and
tell us what you're doing in these areas, and then also this example.
Well, when I travel, I'm traveling because local diaspora Indian immigrant communities contact me and say, hey, Peter, we have an issue going on here. We love you. We respect your work. We would ask if you would please come out at our invitation and do something in the local area about what's going on here. In this one particular case in Chicagoland area in Illinois, I think I probably spent the most time there last year. I spent probably about 6 weeks. And I went out at the invitation of the local community because there's a member of US Congress named Raja Krishnamurti, who was running for re-election. At the time when I first went out, he was facing his primary, which was in June. And then I went out after he did, and as anticipated, win the primary, and did some more work in relation to him leading up to the general election. And basically, he is actually another one of these members of US Congress, like Tulsi Gabbard was. And actually, thank God, at the moment, as far as US Congress goes, he is the only actual member that I would point to out of, I believe, 4 or 5 Indian Americans, out of, I think, at least 4 Hindus elected to Congress. At least 2 of those Hindus are actually stringently anti-Hindu nationalist, vocally anti-Hindu nationalist. This particular member is the only member currently in office who has these sorts of like monetary ties to these donors that I've mentioned. Beyond that, and when I focus on researching and documenting what's happening with these politicians, I make sure when I'm reporting that it's not a one-off situation. So it's not even just monetary ties. And definitely, if it's monetary ties, it has to be something where it's over a long period of time. It's a pattern, but it's also to a large extent them actually attending events organized by these Hindu nationalist groups as well, especially on a pattern type of basis, which Tulsi Gabbard had done, which this guy Congressman Raja Krishnamurti had done. So I went out at invitation, participated in some rallies, some protests. Went around, took advantage of these public comment sections in local city councils within his district, and went around and talked about this as being an issue of concern for the local city. Something that the city officials need to watch out that they don't get entangled with these kinds of relationships. But they need to also be aware of their local congressman and what's going on there. And, at one point, I even got a chance to go to a campaign debate that he was at and confront him in person and ask him on camera his opinion of the RSS, his opinion of this basically burgeoning genocide in India, and got him on camera as I asked the question, quite literally running away from me, having one of his supporters who is actually a member of one of these international organizations and was accompanying him to this debate. This supporter was putting his hands on the congressman's shoulders as I was asking the congressman this question, and then shouted at me and ran him, like rushed him out of the room like he was his handler.
Yeah.
So
Wow.
engaged in activities like that. Yeah.
So
And then just going around and giving lectures to, local diaspora communities and talking about the broad issue, and then, how it's also hitting us here at home in Chicagoland. So that's one of the things that I did specifically there in Illinois. And that sort of thing is generally what I end up spending a lot of time on the road to do, whether it's in this case about a politician, or in the case of, as we talked last year, in the case of being in the Dallas-Fort Worth area in Texas, talking about a local Hindu nationalist organization, which was at the time, the controversy with there was that they were openly and unapologetically raising money for, among other things, funding the demolition of churches in India, as well as funding the reconversion of Christians and Muslims back to Hinduism. Which is a whole other thing. They talk about, they call it reconversion, and they say back to Hinduism, because within this Hindu nationalist ideology, they have the idea that there is no such thing as a genuine convert, that everybody living within India was, they were always Hindus in the past, and therefore everybody who is like practicing non-Hindu today needs to be welcomed back home and brought back into the Hindu fold to be reconverted.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, this example in Texas you mentioned about fundraising for the destruction of churches in India. I mean, that's what's neat is that I actually found out about you from someone, a friend of mine, a ministry we support in India, who sent me this video of you, which then I put in that episode, and then now we connected to get to talk. So it's great to see that your work you're doing is it's around the world, and it's making its way to people in India. And I think it's
I'm so
great.
grateful that connection came out of that incident, because where I'm at today, I'm born and raised in California. I oftentimes when I travel internationally, I tell people I'm a Californian, and they look at me quizzically and they say, "You mean an American?" I say, "No, a Californian." And then they laugh at me. But I'm born and raised in California. I've been working on these issues for 17 years, and I have so many wonderful, beautiful friendships, relationships, and such a huge network with Indians. As I mentioned, in North America, in Europe, throughout the rest of the world, and especially, of course, in India. However, that's my network. And I have a lot of Indian Christian supporters and people that appreciate my work, and that basically beg me to bring this issue to the attention of the international community and of the international and especially the American church.
Mm-hmm.
And so to have that connection occur, where then I'm so glad you reached out to me, because in my experience, that's one of the gaps that needs to be filled, one of the things that's really lacking today. And I often we talk about what the US government does, but honestly, I think that that's of secondary or tertiary importance.
Yeah, that's right.
I think the most important thing right now is not political engagement, but social engagement. And speaking as a Christian, born in the church and practicing Christian today as a believer, I think that that's one of the most potentially impactful things to effect real change on this issue of stopping the persecution of Christians in India, is for the American church to wake up and smell the coffee and take action on the issue. Unfortunately, to wrap up that thought, I've diverted a lot of my attention over the past year or so to intentionally having that be one of the main projects that I work on, is reaching out to the American church, trying to educate them about the issue. And in my experience, 75–80% of them are broadly ignorant that there even is an issue at all. And then trying to get them to rise up and take some action. Thank God, have had a few people in the American church, few clergy members, who finally fired up on the issue, ready to rock and roll and do something. And what I would say needs to be done, and this is the same thing that Indian Christians tell me first and foremost they want, is to pray. That's when I say, what do Indian Christians want American Christians to be doing? They say pray. Well, I mean, certainly you need to know about the issue before you can really effectively pray about it. Mm-hmm. Beyond prayer, though, action is needed. And I don't mean, ultimately, yes, this would include action of, say, reaching out to your member of Congress or someone like that and urging them to take some kind of steps. But the main action I think that's needed is for the American church to start talking about the issue to each other, from church to church, for the clergy members to start educating their congregations, and for then people in the church to start going out and volunteering, raising their hands that they're willing to link arms with Indian Americans, especially with Indian Christians in particular, and stand in unity on this issue, raise their voices, attend the rallies, hold seminars, hold conferences along the way. Yeah, talk to your politicians and all of that.
Well, that's great. And there is hope. I mean, I think I really appreciate the point that you mentioned about the Indian Americans here reaching out to you, asking for this. I mean, this isn't something that we're just kind of making up and making important.
It's not even just it's especially, as you mentioned, this Indian Christian reached out to you, asked you if you knew about me. My experience broadly in America is that Indian American Christians really are asking me this, as well as Indian Christians living back in the country. But amazingly, and this is one of the beautiful things, silver linings persecution, is that I've had Muslims, Indian Muslims, untold numbers. I've had Indian Sikhs, etc. I've had so many of them say, they say to me, Peter, you're a Christian. What can you do to help get the church talking about this? And they're saying to me, Peter, like I'm an Indian Muslim, I'm an Indian Sikh. We're not of the same faith, and they're not trying to get me to be. But what they are trying to get me to do, and what they're saying they want. I'm having Indian Muslims come up and tell me, we want people to talk about the persecution of Indian Christians. I'm having Indian Muslims, like I've had in December when I was in Texas, I had Indian Muslims giving me platforms to bring me on as a speaker, so that I could talk at events organized by Indian Muslims, so that I could talk about what's happening to Indian Christians.
Wow. Well, I mean, I think we're hopefully getting some picking up steam here and getting some momentum and getting the word out. And I definitely think that the church is starting to sort of wake up to this reality. I mean, we've seen traces of things happening in the U.S., very light compared to what we're seeing around the world, but it certainly bears resemblance of what could be coming. So as we wrap up here, is there anything else you wanted to share, and then let everybody know where they can get in touch with you and follow what you're doing and the work you're up to?
Well, there's so much more that I could share, Ryan, and I could go on and on in great detail about both what's happening in India, why it's happening, who's doing it, how it's connected to the US and to other countries around the world. But the main thing I want to share is just that I hope and pray that for your audience, especially Christian listeners, that they would perk up, recognize this, one, that the persecution is happening, and then also recognize the severity of it. And that their voice is the voice of one person, one at a time. The voice of one person is something that can begin to make a huge difference. And as far as my work, I would say check out my website. Hopefully people can figure it out by hopefully figuring out how to spell my name to access it, but it's peterfriedrich.com. I'm also extremely active on Twitter. And again, you just search my name, Pieter Friedrich. I'm on YouTube, and YouTube is probably the easiest, best place, one-stop shop to go and find all of my videos as far as speaking at rallies, speaking at giving lectures at conferences, speaking at city halls and public comments and that sort of thing. And beyond that, yeah, again, I guess last thought, I would just hope and pray that like Christians perk up to this. And that one of the things for me as somebody that's unapologetic about my faith, I'm not out there evangelizing what I am, and I'm not out there working as a Christian, but a lot of what I do is because I'm a Christian and I believe in the principles of the faith. And when I see this happening, where, as I mentioned, we have, for instance, Indian Muslims coming up and asking me to talk about Indian Christians, or asking me to do what I can to get other people talking about Indian Christians, it really reminds me so much of the Good Samaritan, and of just the who is my neighbor question. And that I urge Muslims to do the same. I urge every audience I speak to do the same. Even if it's not a member of your faith, certainly, at least if you're a Christian, the least you should be doing is talking about what's happening to members of your faith, our Christian brothers and sisters around the world, whether it's in India or elsewhere. But beyond that, the call is to recognize that who is my neighbor? Well, my neighbor's basically everybody else, Christian or non-Christian, and I'm supposed to love them as myself. And that we should hopefully, and this is beyond the specific field in which I'm in, something that I would urge everybody, as just generally a human rights advocate and a believer, is to speak up for the persecuted, no matter who they are, no matter where they're found.
Well said. Thank you so much for being on the show. We definitely want to be speaking up for the persecuted, shining light on that so that we can have our eyes wide open. So, Peter, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Ryan. Pleasure.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining. Go to ryanshoward.com to find more episodes and to get in touch with us. And you can find Peter's website and all the links he mentioned in the show notes as well.